Hello and welcome to another edition of Proficio Cyber Chats. Today we would like to welcome Scott Jarkoff, Director of the Strategic Threat Advisory Group for CrowdStrike, and Ardan, APAC SOC Director for Proficio. Today our guests are going to be discussing how cybersecurity teams can take a proactive approach to staying safe, how an adversary might deploy a ransomware attack, and what can you do to stop an attack at the early stages. And why has one specific industry become such an appealing target for cybercriminals? Let's chat. Ransomware continues to be the biggest threat for organizations worldwide. How can cybersecurity teams take a proactive approach to staying safe?
I think from my perspective, one of the key things that organizations need to do to keep themselves safe is to change the mindset that they have regarding cybersecurity. A lot of the times we have run into situations where we talk to people about cybersecurity and their key concern is oh, actually we do not really have the budget, or we do not really think that this is a priority for us right now. And I think that is an approach that is not going to work out well in a era where cyber attacks are becoming more and more frequent and more in-depth and more sophisticated, right? So I think that mindset change is very critical, and key to that is also how they look at the risk and the financial impact of security breaches, right? A lot of times they only find out when the attack happens, and at that point it's really too late to be talking about prevention. So I guess this is something that organizations need to take into account when they are planning out their cybersecurity, when they are planning out how they should react, how they should allocate resources to protect their organizations. Scott, what do you think?
No, I would absolutely agree. I think the mindset change is one of the biggest, I guess, hurdles that I think the industry needs to overcome. Right, is just getting into the right mindset and really looking at this as when I say this, I guess really looking at security as an investment, not as a deterrent, or not as something that's designed to prevent people from getting their job done, but ultimately at the end of the day it's an enabler, right? And that is a huge mindset change that I think needs to occur in order for I think most organizations to really start to take this issue seriously and to kind of get over the hump that they have with really understanding what it is that they're facing. But also, I think another component that people really need to take into account is what's the effect of the ransomware, and not just the obvious, hey, my entire network has now just been locked up behind ransomware, but it's also how do I now move forward now that the entire network is locked up? What's the next step? Do we engage the attackers? Do we ignore the attackers? What are those next steps? What are the attackers' end goals? Or obviously it's some kind of financial reward, but is there going to be a component of extortion, which is something that we've seen quite a bit over the course of 2020 in particular, and now into 2021, is this idea of being extorted in addition to the ransom demand. So I think we could probably agree, and I'll use this as kind of like a point for pausing and turning it back over to you, but I think we could probably agree that not paying the ransom is, generally speaking, I mean, obviously there may be some certain circumstances depending on the nature of the organization that's been hit and the need for remaining operational or getting back operational relatively quickly. But I think we can probably agree that not paying the ransom is, generally speaking, the right route to take. I mean, would you agree or disagree with that?
Yes, I would definitely agree. I mean, paying the ransom doesn't really guarantee an outcome, right? And what all that they promise you is that maybe they will release the data back to you, or they will release your systems, but they still have backdoors, they still have the data they've exfiltrated from an environment, right? And your ransom is not covering what they're going to do with those data. And honestly speaking, would you agree to let a random stranger have access to your data without them signing legal agreements, knowing who to find should something goes wrong? So I don't even think this should really be a consideration, because first of all, they are already acting outside of legal means. So why would you think that a simple ransom would compel them to obey the letter of the law, right? This doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah, agreed. And then I think what we've also seen is this idea of extortion, right? Where the it doesn't end necessarily with the ransom demand, like, so as we've agreed that the best course of action is not to pay the ransom, just as a quick divergence, paying the ransom ultimately ends up just, kind of breeding more ransomware as more victims pay the ransom demands that they're being, kind of, I guess, forced into paying, so to speak. That all that does is breed more ransomware because the other attackers see that ransomware attacks are successful, and then, okay, well, hey, I want to get in on that game. Is kind of what the mindset is.
Yeah, I think in some situations there are even cases of extortion based on data exfiltrated, even when there's no ransomware involved. Like I think recently the Acelion FTA attacks, right, by allegedly by the Cloud ransomware gang. They made use of vulnerabilities on Acelion FTA, exfiltrated a bunch of data, and then they started, talking to the organization in question about, hey, I got some of your data, right? So I think that's part of the evolution, right? It's a straightforward decision usually for companies whose data have been locked up on their environment, right? To say, you know what, I don't want to pay the ransom. Let's not encourage this. But the calculus becomes a little bit more complex when we look at situations where the data has already been moved out of their control, so to speak, into the hands of the adversaries, right? So I think that's a very interesting and unique question, and yeah, like I said, you can't really trust them, but at the same time, we have to develop defensive strategies to prevent against such situations from happening, and preventing executives or organizations in question from being put into that position, and that's part of that
Yeah.
mindset change. Yeah.
Yeah, 100% agreed. And I think this is another piece of that mindset change is making sure that organizations invest in quality backup systems, because that's the way that you're going to recover from a ransomware attack quickly, is with the right backup systems. And if you're doing backups on a recurring basis and you have the right systems in place and deployed the right technologies, recovering from ransomware, while quite painful, can actually be done fairly. I use the term easy quite loosely, because that's all dependent upon the organization, but it definitely is going to be a whole lot easier than paying millions of dollars potentially, and then opening yourself up to future attacks from additional adversaries that have seen that you've have a penchant to pay.
Perhaps one of the best ways to truly safeguard against ransomware is to understand the mechanics behind it. How does an adversary deploy a ransomware attack, and what can you do to stop an attack at the early stages?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it kind of hits on one of my, I don't know if I want to use the term pet peeves, but I guess it is. Just when organizations don't really understand how the attackers are conducting their attacks. I mean, then if you don't understand how attacks are being conducted, then you're almost assuring like defeat in this situation. It's really important to understand how any attack occurs, but in particular, because we're talking about ransomware, and it does have a very specific attack sequence. Like, we can talk about it conceptually, how this works, and why this is important is, if you're so focused on the ransomware component of a ransomware attack, then you're going to completely miss the earlier stages of the attack. So, basically the malware downloader deploys the banking Trojan, which deploys the ransomware. And again, so going back to my comment earlier, if you're so focused on the ransomware, you're going to completely miss that malware downloader or that banking Trojan. And the goal here is to stop this at the earliest stage of the attack possible, because the earlier you catch it, the better chances are that you have at preventing an outbreak of a ransomware.
The whole attack sequence, being able to understand this is very critical to planning out a good defensive strategy, right? A good monitoring strategy. So the fact that they go through so many different steps, it also represents an avenue for us as defenders to be able to catch them, as they go through, right? So if it's they are doing all of this to stay under detection, but it also, because of the long attack surface, it presents a lot of avenues for detection if we plan out our defensive strategy properly. And I think that also ties in with what we mentioned about the mindset change earlier. I think previously a lot of security involves, you know what, I have a firewall, so my perimeter security is done, right? I have maybe some antivirus or some simple endpoint solutions, and that's it for my endpoint. But they never really consider approaching their infrastructure, their crown jewels from an attacker's perspective, right? So if I'm the attacker, where am I going to go once I'm inside your system? Do we have any visibility on such network activity within the network? Are we able to identify? Are we able to differentiate between a friend or foe in a network environment? And I think knowing this conceptual attack sequence that Scott has talked so much about is very, very key. And really, we need to move beyond, talking about firewall takes care of perimeter security, endpoint security is taken care of by the endpoint. It's really a combination of all of these, and understanding where in your environment valuable data is stored and how are they protected, and what visibility you have, what are the opportunity you have to catch those attacks, and that will really make a difference, right?
Yeah, that's a great point, Arden. And I would also, kind of extend this in the context of defense. I mean, as you mentioned, it takes, multiple tools, multiple capabilities in order to defend the network. And I would also argue that technology is not like the only thing that organizations need to leverage. Also, doing human-based threat hunting as well, I think is extremely important, because if we think about like living off the land techniques, leveraging those native operating system tools, a lot of times technology just has a bit of difficulty detecting that kind of activity. Because if we consider a administrator on a network who's moving laterally around the network using RDP versus an attacker on the network moving laterally around the network using the same tool, RDP, how does technology differentiate between the two? How does it know that the attacker's there for nefarious reasons versus the admin's there for legit reasons? I think, throwing technology at every problem is not necessarily going to solve it. You also need a combination of humans and technology if you're going to actually, kind of, I guess, win at this game, for lack of a better way of saying it.
Yeah, I definitely agree 100%. And something that I've always told my analysts, right, is that, technology or tools, right, they are an enabler, right? They allow you to do more with less, but at the end of the day, they are not an analyst, right? They are not supposed to be the one to tell you whether this is malicious or not malicious. They can help you with certain types of investigation, but you as an analyst have to make that decision. And when you make the decision, you have to base it off on what you have identified, right? Even if, for example, online sources says that this particular tool is not malicious, but let's say if you find that there are some suspicious ways in which the tools are being used, and it's happening in a time where nobody should be using this tool, there are certain weird behavior associated with the tool usage. That's plenty of reason to flag this as a security incident instead of just saying, oh, you know what, this is present in all Windows systems, so it's not really a threat, right? And that's exactly how attackers want to get past defenders, right? Oh, this seems to be perfectly normal. It doesn't seem to be anything. Let's move on, right? So yeah, I think the key part is training up analysts, right? And not just the analysts, the cybersecurity team, and not just the cybersecurity team, the IT team, basically anybody that has access to your data, the organization's data, they need to be trained and they need to understand how the attacker is going to approach the situation, so that they know when to flag something that they find suspicious. It's all about the mindset, and it's about making security a key part of operations instead of an afterthought. Yeah, like we discussed earlier as well.
One of the most common targets for cyber criminals is the healthcare industry. What makes this industry so appealing?
I think this is a combination of several factors, right? Healthcare industry is also one of those industry where there's a lot of legacy equipment, legacy servers that they are forced to use, maybe because of certain operational needs or simply because there isn't any new version of this software or equipment, medical equipment. And I think that's also one of the very open opportunities for attacks, because when you're using legacy equipment, you're dealing with a lot of vulnerabilities, a lot of loopholes that are not necessarily actively being supported by a lot of vendors, and partially also because of the sort of data that they hold, right? Critical personal information, medical data that people are willing to pay for, and people are going to find absolutely important, right? I mean, if it's just something holding maybe my phone number, it's not really that critical to me personally. But if it's holding my medical records, what kind of medication I'm taking, is there any kind of illnesses that I have, right? That suddenly becomes a lot more critical to a lot of people, and the adversaries are also aware of this. So that's also why the healthcare industry is such a right target for attacks. A combination of opportunity, a combination of the type of data that they are exposed to, and simply because it's also such a big sector, right?
Yeah, 100% agreed. And I would also add a couple of additional points, right? So what we often see, like in particular with like e-crime, the primary driver for criminals to attack, I guess, verticals like healthcare, and in particular healthcare, is the requirement to be operational, right? Those systems need to be up, because if those systems aren't up, then the healthcare industry, in particular, like hospitals and frontline medical services, they're not going to be able to save lives. And so from an attacker's perspective, if they are able to get into that network, deploy ransomware, and disrupt it, lock it down completely, then they feel like there's a greater chance of success of payment in that situation, right?
And I think to add on to that also, the healthcare industry also has a lot of intellectual property that are valuable in this day and age, right? COVID-19 vaccines, phase 3 studies, right? Understanding of how the vaccines were created, right? I think some of the vaccines utilizes a newer creation method that maybe certain other nation states do not have access to. So they would be very motivated to try to understand, how exactly are these the way these vaccines are created.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Because, the COVID-19 vaccines in particular, I think are very topical, right? I mean, there's only a limited number of vaccines that are actually kind of being administered worldwide. Let's, kind of put aside, some of the vaccines in some of the other countries that I think we would probably be a little bit concerned with subjecting ourselves to. But, the three major vaccines that are available today, those are, those companies obviously were targeted by multiple nation states, because those nations, generally speaking, they will supplement their own research and development through cyber activity like this, going and stealing intellectual property through espionage operations, and then using that as a way to kind of jumpstart their own vaccine programs, or to kind of supplement it and just see what they're doing in contrast to what everyone else is doing. And so stealing intellectual property is a huge component of that. And this is another reason that healthcare is so attractive, is all that, as Ardan said, all that intellectual property that's held in those organizations. And we're not talking just about hospitals, or we're talking about research organizations. We're talking about universities that are conducting research and trials on different biopharmaceuticals and whatnot. So the ceiling is kind of endless here, but at the end of the day, this is a very attractive target for the adversaries, whether we're talking about criminal or nation state. But I think in particular on the nation state side, just because of the ability to help those countries kind of jumpstart and increase their economic capacity through espionage.
A lot of recent cybercrimes have involved nation state activity. What are some of the trends we've seen, and how will those evolve in the future?
Yeah, I mean, so, most of the activity that we've seen doesn't really deviate too much from, what we've seen in the past. And that's, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is the idea of stealing intellectual property for economic capacity building. I mean, that's a huge component. But some of the more recent trends that we've seen, at end of, or I should say probably throughout 2020, but kind of, Q3, Q4 2020, and also Q1 2021, is this idea of the nation state adversaries who are kind of adopting techniques from the e-criminals, or the those adversaries that we would generally and more readily associate with deploying ransomware. So it's kind of like an interesting evolution here, where we're starting to see these nation state adversaries kind of adopting these techniques that are more traditionally associated with e-crime, where it's all about financial gain as opposed to traditional espionage or disruption.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's a lot about, you know, how successful these e-crime techniques have been. And it's not particularly surprising for nation states to be using such techniques because, hey, it's working, right? It's very clearly it's working. And so why not let's use it for our own purpose as well? I mean, it's not really a surprise given that how ransomware has become more and more effective, larger and larger in scale, and basically more and more popular because mainly because there's been fairly successful as a technique of choice. And for nation state actors, really, I mean, they want the way they work to be effective to get results, and that's really the key considerations that they have. So it's a very interesting evolution and interesting change. And for us as defenders, really, the line between nation state actors and e-crime is getting thinner and thinner. And there are also lots of e-crime cyber criminal actors that are using very sophisticated techniques that in the past would be normally associated with nation state actors, simply because they know that this is also a way that works. And whether be it cyber criminals or nation states, they are really focused on what works and what gets them the results.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It does seem to be kind of like the nation state criminals kind of taking a page out of the e-crime actor playbook, because they see what's working. And so if we're to kind of quantify the amount of e-crime activity that we saw in 2019 versus what we saw in 2020, I think we saw about a 330% increase year over year in e-crime. And so that lets you know e-crime is actually working. I think we started to see in 2020 where e-criminals are kind of acting on behalf of nation states, like conducting attacks that would traditionally be associated with nation states, so the espionage stuff. So a lot of this is all, as you said, it's kind of like just the line between what is a nation state and what is a criminal is just very, very blurry. It's really kind of, the distinction is hard to tell and is becoming more difficult to tell as as time passes on. And that just means that we need to be more cognizant and more aware of how these adversaries conduct these attacks. Just to kind of go back to an earlier point, understanding the attack sequence of ransomware is important, but understanding any attack and how these adversaries conduct their attacks, I think, is imperative. And really having that visibility and being able to understand all facets of an attack are really the keys to kind of moving towards lowering risk and being able to defend against these attacks.
We'd like to thank Scott and Ardan for taking the time to chat with us today. If you have any questions regarding any of the topics discussed today, please feel free to reach out to us at proficio.com or proficio.es in Spanish. Thanks again for joining us, and hope you tune in to the next episode of Proficio Cyber Chats.